see how that proceeds. I don't mind if we go spontaneous here with questions following up on these. Some of these questions I may be very short with, and or just say I don't know. And other questions may merit some further thought. So we'll go ahead and get started with this. I would like to, before I do that, because I'm afraid if I don't do it now, I'll forget. I have a tendency to do that. I do want to tell you a little bit about the ministry that I'm the director of and what we do. It's called the Institute for Religious Research. It's based in Cedar Springs, Michigan, which is a suburb north of Grand Rapids. I'm the executive director there. I've been there almost exactly 10 years now, 10 years next month. It was started by a Christian businessman whose nephew joined the Mormon church. So a disproportionately large number of our resources online are about Mormonism, but we also have resources on Jehovah's Witnesses, other groups, and also just a lot of resources on the Bible, Christianity, Christian doctrines such as the deity of Christ and the Trinity, salvation, and things of that nature. So our website is irr.org, irr.org, and you can visit that website and find a wealth of resources. We have a series of articles that I'm doing on Jehovah's Witnesses called Answers to Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's an ongoing series that's going to be working on. I'm going to be working on that for many months, but it's already got 8 articles in the series there, and so take a look at that and visit our website. You can send us questions, and we have some resources that we sell, but we don't sell a lot of products. Mainly we just provide free resources. In fact, some of the things that we have in the way of books or DVDs, we often give those away, especially to Mormons, because again, we do a lot of work with Mormons, and we will provide that material generally free, or in some cases just for shipping, because we're really just trying to get materials into people's hands. So I'm going to look at some of these questions here with us, and we'll just see how this goes. I'm going to put my glasses on because it makes it easier to read the questions. All right, so this has already been touched on a little bit earlier, I think, but I'll start with this one. In 2 of the talks, there was an emphasis placed on the He of the Holy Spirit. I wrestled with this in my own faith. The Greek was referenced as being neuter in these passages as an argument against the personality of the Holy Spirit. How do you address that with the witness, Jehovah's Witness, when the focus is on the He and they are taught it's with the focus on the Greek reference being neutral, or neuter, I think is what he means here. All right, so let me explain something here. Greek has Greek nouns and pronouns and articles, the words that we translate the. These Greek words have, in biblical Greek, ancient Greek, inside and outside the Bible as well, have what are called 3 grammatical genders. Now, that's a very loose term because one of the genders is neuter, but masculine, feminine, and neuter genders. And what that term misleads a lot of people because it makes it sound like a word that is masculine in gender refers to a male, and a word that is feminine in gender refers to a female. And if it's neuter, then it refers to a non-person, somebody that's not person. This is how many people think of this. But ancient Greek, and probably modern Greek as well, I don't read modern Greek, and other languages such as modern German does the same thing. It also has these 3 genders. These genders are simply grammatical conventions that have to do with the form of the word as it's evolved in the history of the language. And a word can be masculine, feminine, or neuter, and you can't tell from that one bit whether it's referring to a person or not. So, for example, in German, das Mädchen means the girl, and it's neuter in grammatical gender. Doesn't mean the girl isn't a person. In New Testament, the New Testament, we often find Jesus, and I think occasionally others, but especially Jesus in the Gospels, referred to as the child or as a child, paideon, and paideon is a neuter form in its gender form. The ending on is a dead giveaway, because that's the most common ending of a neuter noun, at least in the nominative case, which is the subject case. So what I'm getting at here is the fact that it's neuter or masculine or feminine doesn't tell you anything about whether this is a person or not, or what kind of a person. Now, in the New Testament, we find the word spirit, which is pneuma, which is neuter in form. It's in its grammatical gender. So when it has a pronoun relating back to pneuma, it's neuter. The pronoun is neuter. And if you're going to translate every neuter pronoun as it, then you would use it. So you'll see in the King James Version in Romans 8:16, for example, where it says it in reference to the Spirit, bearing witness with our spirits. But that's simply a very literalistic, there's the text, the Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit. Now, the neuter pronoun or the neuter noun it's a grammatical function. It doesn't tell you anything about whether the Spirit is a person or not, just like paideon doesn't tell you that the child is not a person. In fact, you know the child is a person. It's not a question, because you know what the word child means. Now, the Spirit that's the word spirit in Greek. Pneuma is a neuter word. But in the New Testament, the Spirit is also called the Parakletos. I talked about this in my earlier session. Parakletos is a masculine noun. Now, the fact that it's a masculine noun doesn't prove that the Parakletos is a person, but it's consistent with the fact that the term Parakletos means an agent, a representative, a go-between, a helper, a counselor, an advocate, somebody that comes to your aid in helping you connect with somebody else. So somebody that is able to help you get in with somebody else. That's basically what an advocate or a parakletos is. And in this case, the Holy Spirit is being described as an advocate with the Father, just as Jesus was and is for us as well. And you see that in 1 John 2:1. Jesus is our advocate with the Father. Well, the Holy Spirit is also an advocate for us, because Jesus told the disciples in John 14:16 that he was going to send another advocate, and that's Parakletos. Now, when Parakletos is the subject and a pronoun is used in reference to Parakletos in John 14-16 in those passages, and that does happen a few times, the pronoun happens to be masculine. But it has to be, because Parakletos is masculine. In some cases, it's unclear what the antecedent or the noun that the pronoun is referring to is, but if the pronoun is neuter, it's referring back to pneuma. If it's masculine, it's referring back to Parakletos. So that's just a grammatical convention. It's got nothing to do with whether the person is a person or not. If it's a person, it's a person. And there's abundant evidence that the Holy Spirit is a person. So it's wrong to use the grammatical form by itself of the pronoun or a noun to argue that it is a person or that it isn't a person. That doesn't have anything to do with it. It's what the word means and how it's used in context that tells you whether it's referring to a person or not. Okay. 1 1 Corinthians 15:45. What does it mean, and how would you explain it to a Jehovah's Witness? 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul says, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. In this now here's, I don't want to just stand up here and answer questions without making it useful to you in some way. So I want you to understand how we should go about trying to answer a question like this. The first rule of thumb when you're reading a statement in a particular verse that somebody's throwing at you and you want to understand what it means is to read it in context. So that, context is like what Mark Twain said about the weather. Everybody talks about it, nobody ever does anything about it. Well, it's the same kind of thing with context. You often hear people say, well, you're taking that out of context, but they never look at the context. So how do you do that? Well, you actually open the passage and you go back at least a few sentences or something and try to see what's going on in the passage and try to get a sense of how we got to this particular statement in verse 45. Okay, so that's the method. It's a simple thing to do, and if you're ever talking with somebody and they throw a Bible verse at you, and you're not familiar with it and you're not sure what to make of it, the first thing to do is to say, can we look at that passage? And I'm not sure if I really know exactly what's going on off the top of my head, but if we could maybe read that in context, maybe we can get an idea. All right, so then that's what we'll do. So we open to 1 Corinthians 15. And we look back a few verses and try to get an idea of where we are. Well, this whole chapter is talking about the resurrection. And we'll go back to verse 42, and we'll read 42 to 44. So this is 1 Corinthians 15, 42 through 44. So also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body, it is raised an imperishable one. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual one. Now our verse that we're trying to figure out what it means. Verse 45, so also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Now, to finish reading the context, we'll go forward a few verses. So verse 46, however, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, then the spiritual. The first man is from the earth, earthy. The second man is from heaven. Now, wait a minute. The second man is from heaven. Who's the second man? Jesus. Well, I thought Jesus wasn't a man now. I thought he was resurrected as a glorious angel, spirit creature, and he's no longer a man. Well, he used to be a man. But that's not what it says. It says the second man is from heaven. Now, this whole passage, and we could go on at least through verse 49 and really all the way through verse 54 if we wanted. This whole passage is contrasting the mortal body that we have now with the immortal body that we will have in the resurrection. The mortal body is weak. The resurrection body is powerful. The mortal body, of course, is mortal. It's corruptible. That means it's falling apart and dying. The immortal body, the resurrection body, is immortal, incorruptible, imperishable. The mortal body is shameful. It's dishonoring. It's embarrassing. Some of our bodies are more embarrassing than others. The resurrection body will be glorious. It will be honorable. It will be highly esteemed. It'll be great. The present body, the mortal body, is described in verse 44 as a natural body, and the resurrection body as a spiritual body. Now, this is the key to understanding verse 45. And unfortunately, because of the way English works in comparison to Greek, the relationship between verse 44 and 45 is a little obscured in the English translation. But verse 44, the term natural, is related to our term living being in verse 45. A living soul. Soul, or being in some translations, is the noun to which natural is an adjective. So you could translate natural as soulish. So to get the connection between verse 44 and verse 45, think about it this way. It is sown a soulish body, it is raised a spiritual body. Then verse 45, the first man Adam became a living soul, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So the contrast between soul and spirit in verse 45 is connected to the contrast between the soulish, or natural, and the spiritual in verse 44. All right, so you're with me so far? Sorry, there's a little bit of technical stuff here, but trying to keep it somewhat simple. Now, here's where everybody tends to get a little bit confused unless they've got some help and some background on this. Many people looking at verse 44 think a natural body is one of these, and a spiritual body is like an angel body that's immaterial, that's non-physical, non-flesh, etc. So that the contrast is between a material and an immaterial kind of being. That is not correct. How do I know that's not correct? Because Paul's already introduced this language earlier in the epistle. Now here's another thing about reading in context. I hate to break it to you, but the Bible did not come to us in isolated verses. It didn't even come to us in isolated short passages that you could put on an index card. It came to us in books, in texts that sometimes go on for many pages. And the author wrote those texts expecting that you started at the beginning and read through to the end, and that you were listening and paying attention. And also he expected that you would know what he meant because you were part of his culture, which unfortunately we are not, right? 19 centuries later, going on 20 centuries later, we have to bridge that gap. So, earlier in 1 Corinthians, chapter 2, same epistle, same author, same book. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14. A natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, etc. Verse 15. But he who is spiritual, the spiritual person, he who is spiritual appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no one. And Paul uses this language of natural and spiritual man and other applications of it later in the same book and outside of 1 Corinthians as well. Now, does 1 Corinthians 2, verses 14 and 15 mean that there are two kinds of men or human people, one that has a physical body and one that doesn't? The natural man is contrasted with the spiritual man, but they're both human beings with physical bodies. The natural man is only going by what he can see, smell, taste, touch, feel, hear. He's only going by his senses. He's only going by his own assumptions about the nature of reality. He's not going by divine revelation. He's going by what he thinks he can figure out based on his own steam, going on his own steam. The spiritual man is the person who is being led by the Spirit of God to hear and receive God's revelation in the gospel. But they're both human beings. So now in 1 Corinthians 15:44, when Paul says there's a natural body and there's also a spiritual body, he's talking about two kinds of human beings' bodies. one that's mortal and falling apart, and one that's immortal and glorious. Okay, now that we understand the language of verse 44, we can close our little study here by revisiting verse 45. So also it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living soul, a living natural being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. Here, spirit does not mean an incorporeal, non-human person, but rather that Jesus Christ has the supernatural, eternal life in his immortal resurrection body and person that he can now give to others. So soul and spirit here are two aspects of human nature, one of which is our natural state, the other of which is our intended resurrection, immortal, and glorified state. Jesus is there first, and he doesn't only have that life, he's able to give it to others. So life-giving spirit does not mean he's an incorporeal being. It doesn't mean he's no longer physical. Are you tracking with me here a little bit? It's a little bit long-winded. I apologize. I tend to do that, but hopefully that was clear. So much of what we just saw there we could get without knowing Greek. A little bit, it turned out to be helpful. So using good reference works that elucidate that stuff can also be helpful. I think I can do this one a little bit briefer. Judges 1:19, why couldn't the Lord drive out the inhabitants of the valley? It says that because they had chariots of iron. It doesn't say the Lord couldn't do it. It says that the Israelites couldn't do it. It's Judges 1:19. There's some translations say he could not drive, but he is referring to Judah there. The Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they, NASB, he, other versions, could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. All right, Judah is one of the tribes of Israel here, and sometimes the tribe is referred to by name and referred back to in the singular because it's the tribe. So Judah was not able to complete the job because of the chariots of iron. What this implies, I guess, is that they had some faith that God was going to help them do the job, but it only went so far. And so they saw the chariots of iron and said, you know what, we're not going to take that on. And so they didn't do that. This is going to be an I don't know answer, ultimately. Joshua 10, please explain how the sun stood still. I don't know. Now, of course, what we're talking about here is in relative terms. That is, how is it that the sun appeared to remain in the sky for a whole day longer than normal? Because, of course, the sun and the earth are both moving, but from our perspective, it looks like the sun is going around the earth, and Joshua is describing the sun's movement from an earthbound perspective, just as we would today when we talk about the sun going down. So it's phenomenological language that's being used here to describe how things appear. That still doesn't answer the question of how it was possible for the sun to appear to remain in the sky for apparently at least part of an extra day, if not an entire extra day. We don't know. This would be some kind of a miracle. I would assume that this is not saying that the earth actually stopped spinning on its axis. From that scientific perspective, that is not likely to be a correct assumption. Now, you may have heard stories about NASA scientists or something like that, or people at JPL or somewhere like that, finding an extra day looking at the records of the astronomical observations of the past compared to history and blah, blah, blah. There's nothing to it. It's just it's an urban legend, I guess you could call it. Fodder for those websites that look at these fake stories. So there's nothing to that. There's also nothing to the story about scientists in Siberia digging a hole looking for oil and finding hell. That didn't happen either. So we don't have any scientific way of corroborating or confirming that this happened. Scientifically or naturally speaking, it's not possible to happen naturalistically, but we don't need to say that it happened naturalistically. So I don't know what the options are for how God might have made that happen. So sometimes the better part of valor is just to admit that you don't know. And I don't really know how that would. We don't know how God does any of his miracles. How did Jesus multiply bread and fish? I don't know. Because he's God, it's my short answer. This question was asked by an 11-year-old child. Sure, yeah. No, I'm just kidding. The question is, if God did not, these are great, this actually does sound like an 11-year-old came up with this, because they asked the best questions. If God did not create anything, would there be the color black? That is a great question. I have been answering questions for 30 years, and nobody has ever asked me that before. The answer is no. There would not be the color black, because color presupposes the existence of a number of things, not the least of which is the eye, which is able to observe, the contrast between the presence of light in a room and the lack of it. So black is a color that is observed with the eye. If you have no eye, you don't have color in the sense of what we're talking about. Now, I guess you could say if light passes through a prism and there's nobody to observe it, does that mean there's no color? I guess that's a different question. Like if the tree falls in the forest and there's nobody to hear it, does it make a sound? Or the joke about let me sure I get this right now. If a man says something wrong and his wife isn't there to hear it, is it wrong? That old joke. But anyway, the color thing assumes an eye that's able to observe a lack of light with an organ that's able to observe it. It assumes the existence of a world where you can have all these things happen. What does Daniel 8:14 mean? Daniel 8:14. This is one of those verses that certain groups get real excited about because they think that they can decode it and discern something about the end times. And funny, when these people do this, the end times are always right around the corner. So they will, if you're living in the medieval world, it might be pointing forward to the year 1000 or something. If you're living in the 1800s, it's referring to something that's coming up in the 1800s, or maybe the early 1900s, and so on. And this is how people have played this kind of game, which the late Bill Alner, a friend of mine, liked to call pin the tail on the Antichrist. That kind of thing that people do with the Bible is not helpful. Now, here again, I want to use this to illustrate how one goes about answering Bible questions. And the same principle that we just talked about is the first principle to apply here, and that is to look at the context. Here we have this reference in Daniel 8:14 to 2300 evenings and mornings. Now, he says, for 2300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. So this is an answer to a question in verse 13. How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? There's different ways of translating some of this language, but the point is, how long is this going to go on where there's going to be an interruption to the sacrifices being offered in the sanctuary or the temple? And of course, in context, this would be the temple in Jerusalem, because that's what this passage is talking about. So the idea here is the temple is going to have an interruption of sacrifice for a period of 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, scholars have proposed two ways of taking that. They've proposed taking that to mean 2,300 days, or they've proposed taking it to mean a total of 2,300 evenings and mornings, which would be 1,150 days. That is half of the 2,300. 1,150 days would be 3.5 years. That figure comes up elsewhere in Daniel. It also comes up later in the book of Revelation. It's found in several places. I think it's reasonable to understand the number to refer to a period of 3.5 years. The third interpretation is the one that groups like the Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses have played with over the years in various places and times, and that is that it's referring to 2,300 years. And the reason why they want to do that is because they figure if they can find out when the period began and figure out when it ends, we can find a date in Bible prophecy that's somewhere in our time period. And so then they will claim that it's sometime in the 19th century is what the Adventists thought. Well, that is a non-starter. That's not an option for a legitimate interpretation of this passage. And these groups will always say, well, but in Bible prophecy, a day is as a year. And there's a couple of verses that they quote to back this up. So Jesus was executed on the cross, and he rose 3 days later, so I guess that means he rose 3 years later. No. Well, it's a prophecy in the Old Testament that the New Testament writers say was fulfilled in Jesus' death and resurrection, so that it's prophetic. So I guess that if a day is always a year, a code for a year, then I guess that's 3 years. You can see that this leads to some absurd conclusions. In the context, Daniel 8 is talking about events that come out of the conquest of the region by Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, the 300s BC. After Alexander conquered practically the entire known world and died, his kingdom was divided up, carved up into 4 smaller kingdoms. One of them was the kingdom given to a Greek dynasty that ruled Israel, that ruled the Holy Land. There were a number of kings over a period of years that ruled there until a fellow named Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC decided that he was going to force Hellenization on the Jews by desecrating the sanctuary in the temple with a pagan sacrifice, and he was going to force the Jews to accept Greek culture. Well, the Jews basically said to you know what with you, and they rebelled, they revolted, and they kicked the Greeks out. They overthrew Antiochus's rule over them, and they established a period of about a century of independence before the Romans came and put an end to that. That's what Daniel 8 is talking about. Just read the whole chapter. You'll see the big king and the 4 kingdoms and all the rest of it in Daniel 7 and 8. It's all in there. Okay. Yes. Yeah, there's different theories about exactly how to correlate the 2300 evenings and mornings with the period that we're talking about, but most biblical scholars agree that's the period that we're talking about. We're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, the Maccabean revolt. So when the period begins and ends depends on whether you think it's a 7-year period or a 3.5-year period. But that's a minor detail. But yeah, so this is a common understanding, and that note reinforces that point, confirms that it has to do with that period is the common understanding. Other questions? Because I have time for more. Yes. I did not see that. Mm-hmm. Interesting, yeah. I think just looking at photographs from the Hubble and other telescopes of various galaxies and other phenomena out in space makes it increasingly difficult not to view Creator as an artist. Right. That's all right. Oh, wow, yeah. Well, there's a lot to see, and unfortunately, some people look for certain things that they want to confirm their viewpoint rather than to see what's actually there and try to appreciate the beauty. And thank you for putting those up. I mean, it's remarkable. So we live in an astonishing period of time when our knowledge of the world has exploded. I mean, we have access to trillions times more information about the world than we had 200 years ago. Trillions. It's impossible to process it all for any one human being. But what we're finding is, at the same time that we're learning more about the world, we're learning just how beyond our understanding it is. It's remarkable. Any other comments or questions? Yes? For what's my recommendation or my advice to children, to kids witnessing to people in these groups? Yeah, like teens, right. Well, I heard some really good advice earlier from Ed that I think that bears repeating. Don't try to talk about stuff you don't really know and things like that. But I think that all Christians of whatever age and whatever intellectual ability, however much they know, are able to share something. And a child and a young person, a young adult, can talk about what Christ means to them. They can model for people what it means to have your life centered on the person of Jesus Christ rather than on an organization. They can tell the person who's a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or whatever, I'm praying for you, and I'm praying for your family, and is there anything I can do to help you? Show the love of Christ. I think that these are things that we should be doing as older adults as well. But children have an amazing capacity to connect with people, and they should be encouraged to do that. Sometimes kids have interesting ways of witnessing. My daughter, my firstborn, Beth, who was very precocious, we had Mormons come over for dinner, and they came into the house, and they came for dinner, 2 Mormon missionaries. They came into the house, and one of them was carrying the Book of Mormon. And we'd already talked to Beth a little bit about Mormonism, and Beth was a Christian. And so she looked at the Book of Mormon, and she said to the missionaries, "There's lies in that book." I didn't tell her to say that. But then this is the same girl who went into the backyard, climbed up on a toy elephant slide, leaned over the wall, and yelled to the kids next door to ask them if they'd accepted Jesus in their hearts yet. What makes this an interesting story is that the 2 little kids next door were children of 2 Christian missionaries. So here she was trying to evangelize the missionaries' kids. So, but that's another thing about young children that, especially young people, that often gets shamed out of them, is an openness, a willingness, a lack of fear, an honesty, a transparency. We should encourage that. Any other comments or questions? Yes. Thank you for sharing earlier today, by the way.
I have a grandson whose mom is a witness and dad is a Christian, and he will ask me all kinds of spiritual questions when him and I are alone. And how should I go about without offending my daughter-in-law?
Oh. Well, that's a difficult question that probably somebody that doesn't know all of you is not in a very good position to answer, because we're not there. You're going to have to exercise your own discretion and judgment in the matter. I think talking in that sort of situation, talking about things in a non-judgmental, non-condemning, non-hostile way is obviously the most important thing. But you can talk about positive things. You can ask them, so, how are you doing in your religious life? Do you feel like you believe all that? And, where are you with all that? And, is this something that you want to keep believing when you're an adult? And, have you gone through a process of sort of asking the hard questions so you can decide if this is something that you really believe or not? Those kinds of things are something that you could bring up without sort of a frontal assault on the religion. If I could invoke my daughter again as an example here, and this may be recorded, and if it is, she'll see it probably. Beth was very troubled one night. She had a lot of questions, and she was very troubled that she didn't know the answers to these questions. Daddy, how do we know there's a God? How do we know the Bible's true? And, she was worried that maybe something was wrong with her because she was asking all these questions. And I said, Beth, everybody has to ask those questions. You're just asking them 10 years in advance. So we want to encourage young people to ask questions, to be open. If they have doubts, they should feel free to express them. We can say to a person, young or old, do you feel free to ask questions and express any doubts or uncertainty or confusion that you might have where you are in your church or your religion? If you don't, that's too bad. That's not good. You need to be someplace where you're accepted and loved, and you're invited to bring your hard questions, and you're invited to think through things, and you're not made to feel like there's something wrong with you if you don't understand everything or if you have questions. And that's something that we should tell everybody in these groups in one way or another. There's different ways of doing it. And again, the sensitivity and discretion of knowing people and knowing how to respond to them personally is something that can't be, there's no cookie cutter approach, there's no script. You have to feel your way through it. But to be able to communicate somehow that I hope you're in a place where you can ask those questions. If you don't have those questions now, you will have them. Don't be afraid of questions. Don't be afraid of uncertainty. Don't be afraid of, I don't understand why I should believe this. Because those are the questions that lead us from simply accepting what we're being told because we're being told by somebody else, like mommy or daddy or whoever, to actually believing it ourselves. Or not, if it turns out not to be true. But there should be no fear for those who are interested in truth. That's something we need to communicate to other Christians as well, by the way. If you're in a church, your church should be the safest place to feel comfortable asking hard questions, even questions where Christians have different opinions on them, and your church may have a particular position, or your pastor may have a particular position, and maybe you're not sure if you agree with it. Being a Christian does not mean that you have all the right answers to all of the questions. I was once speaking at a church, and somebody asked me a question, and it was 5 minutes to 5, pretty much like it is, almost like it is now. And I said, and it was a very controversial hot potato topic. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. And it's a joke, and then I went ahead and answered it. But unfortunately, many churches are not safe places to ask questions. They're not safe places to ask, how do I know this is true? Or what do I say about same-sex relationships or about the whole gender thing? Is there one Christian answer that's right and everybody should know what it is? And if there is, I'm struggling with it. I'm not sure I know. Some people feel that way. If we make them feel like, well, something wrong with you if you don't already know the answer to that, then they're going to feel, intimidated and not ask the question. Or worse, decide that if you're a Christian, you have to have this answer to this controversial question, that answer to that controversial question, and all the way down the line, and I don't have some of those answers, so I guess I'm not a Christian, or I guess I can't be in this church anymore, or I guess you start looking for an exit. That would be a shame. Churches need to major on the majors, emphasize the essentials of the Christian faith, teach those. We have churches that almost never teach their people on the doctrine of the Trinity or the deity of Christ or any number of other subjects that are very basic to the gospel, very basic to the Christian faith. But they talk a lot about non-essential issues. We need to focus on the majors, major on the majors. We need to treat the minors as minors. We need to help people understand the difference, why some things are make or break, non-negotiable, and others are not. And we need to make them feel like they can ask anything, even about the majors, without feeling like they're not being cared about, not being loved, that somehow asking these questions is a sign of doubt or of a sinful type or unbelief. And let me just say this is especially important for our churches in dealing with those who are passing from childhood to adulthood. Because, as we all know, I think, there are a lot of young people leaving Christianity. Why are they doing that? Well, partly because they can. What I mean by that is, if you only are a Christian because you were raised as a Christian, once you have the freedom to choose, you will sometimes choose not to be a Christian anymore. Many young people are, whether they realize consciously or not, looking for a way out. They're looking for an excuse. They're looking for a rationale to leave. If you tell them, if you believe in X, Y, or Z, you can't be a Christian, and then they go to college and they end up believing in X, they're going to say, well, I guess I'm not a Christian. Which is awfully convenient, because I'd really rather not live like a Christian anyway. I'd rather do my own thing. Young people want to do their own thing, you know. So let's not make it that easy by telling them, oh, if you hold this controversial view on, X, Y, or Z, then you're not a Christian. But rather say, I've got my view on this. Other Christians differ. You need to think it through for yourself. You need to study it. You need to learn as much about it as you can, and come to your own informed conclusion. If it agrees with mine, great. If it doesn't, that doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean that you're not. It doesn't even mean you're not a Christian. It just means we differ on this. That kind of openness and relaxed attitude about this, where you're not making people feel like there's a division brewing if you don't agree on everything, is vital to the health of the church. We cannot advance the cause of the kingdom if we're constantly fighting each other. Maybe I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.